Hello dear students and welcome back to this discussion on modern Indian history. Thus far in this series we have seen how East India Company has been able to establish its rule in India. Bit by bit it has taken over a massive subcontinent. All major Indian powers have been humbled. It has been able to create strong pillars of civil services, police, judiciary, among others, on which their Raj was now standing tall and firm. In this process, the British East India Company has ushered in a new rule which was qualitatively very different from any earlier power in India. India was not new to the rise and fall of powers. But what the East India Company was offering over here was very different from any previous power. The policies of East India Company were based on the colonial agenda of the British. Its administrative policies, revenue policies, trade policies, and many other policies were geared towards increasing exploitation of Indian economy and draining away its wealth to Britain. This naturally had a very adverse effect on the Indian polity, economy, and society. There was a lot of strain on traditional Indian way of life. And this strain will compel Indians to give a response to the altered reality as they saw around them. Today in our discussion, we will be focusing on how Indians will respond to this new altered reality of British rule and how this response will evolve qualitatively in the 19th century. So let's dive in and get started, guys. Indian response can be divided into two parts. In the initial part, the Indian response is what we can call as the traditional response. The traditional response was characterized by certain features. This traditional response was bereft of the understanding of British colonialism. And we cannot fault Indians at that time for this. After all, the idea of colonialism was something very alien to Indians and had developed in a very distant land in West Europe. Consequently, the full working of this idea had not been comprehended by Indians. And therefore, the response that Indians give in the early phase does not factor in this concept of British colonialism. And because it does not factor in this aspect, we see that Indian response will lack certain important aspects. What are those? Indian response will not be driven by modern nationalism in the early phase, during the traditional phase. Modern nationalism, there was always a cultural nationalism, the idea of Bharat Varsha, the idea of, a lot of shared cultural values, heritage, norms, etc. was always there. But then, in the modern sense, the concept of nationalism had not yet taken root. And therefore, it was easy for an Indian troop in the Bengal army to defeat other Indian powers like Marathas or the Mysore. Again, we don't fault them. It was a limitation of the age. That concept of modern nationalism was yet to fully flourish. Similarly, Indians in this traditional response focused mostly on the immediate grievances that they had against the British rule. That might be some traditional privileges abolished, excess assessment of revenue, harsh methods of collection, so on and so forth. While these were legitimate grievances, no doubt, but then these were only focused on what? Focused on the visible symptoms without talking about the root cause. The root cause was a foreign power which was draining away India's wealth in the most invasive way possible. Until and unless this root cause was understood and attempted to be addressed, the problems of Indians could never be solved. As long as you remain only on the superficial level, you are not able to address the real source of the problem. Similarly, Indians at this point were backward looking and wanted to revert back to the old times, turning back the hands of the clock, as they say. Instead of responding and trying to go for more progressive ideas, Indians were basically attempting to go back to previous times, the times of the earlier feudal systems. Britishers, on the other hand, represented a modern civilization based on new ideas. Instead of adopting to these new ideas, the traditional response that will be given by Indians will be focused on going back to the old times, to the feudal type of systems, structures, and leadership. Naturally, the leadership of this early traditional response can also be seen from the semi-feudal element of the society. It was not a new middle class intelligentsia that was leading this response. The leaders over here were generally traditional elites, chiefs, depots, zamindars, military commanders of the heydays of Nawabs and Maharajas. So these type of people are seen to be leading the response against the British rule. So the type of leadership was also different. Very often, this response was peppered with superstitious ideas and beliefs in concepts like messiahs. We'll see that across many different revolts and uprisings that people will convince their followers by using these kind of techniques. So instead of adopting to science and rationality, very often the credulity of the people was used. Again, this is not the fault of the people, guys. We are saying that this was the limitation of that age. Indians at that point had not yet adopted to the modern way of life, and consequently, we see some of these limitations in their approach or response. Very often, these revolts were therefore local. Since there is no modern nationalism, focus is on immediate grievances. The occurrence of this response is mostly at local level. Local issues, local leadership, and local spread. Now, since these were local, most of the times the Britishers were able to suppress them relatively easily. Instead of actually collaborating and building up a massive anti-British front, these responses always remained local and consequently they were episodic. That is, these responses were only for a brief period and could not be sustained over a long time as such. The Britishers, therefore, using some conciliation and most of the times using force and repression, were able to deal with these types of response. Very often, the response resorted to violence. Since the basic idea was traditional, naturally, modern political methods were not used in this response, and you will see that Indians will respond in a violent way through various different types of uprisings. These will be the characteristics of what we can call as traditional response of Indians. But all of this traditional response will not deliver the desired results that Indians were expecting. And consequently, we will see that Indians will then be compelled to change their method. As education will advance, political maturity will increase, and a new middle class intelligentsia will be born, the response of Indians also qualitatively will change. The second way of responding is with what we call as modern response. What are the characteristics of this modern response? Let us see that now. This modern response was grounded in the understanding of colonialism. The idea of colonialism, of how Indian economy was being, very subtly made subservient to British economy. This understanding that was developed by Dadabhai Naoroji and other economists later around mid-19th century, this will enable Indians to actually give a better response to the British rule in India. The idea of Swadeshi, boycott, all of that could be achieved only because of this broader understanding of British colonialism and how it works. Secondly, it would be based on modern nationalism. Indians spread across the subcontinent, irrespective of their religion, creed, language, and all other differences that they might have, started to believe in the idea of modern nationalism, that we are one people and we are being exploited by a foreign enemy. Consequently, after the modern response starts, we will see that the breadth of this response will go on increasing ever, unlike in case of the traditional response, which was always very local and episodic. Target of this response will be based on deeper analysis of the grievances and will not remain only at the grievance level itself. Like for instance, when Indians will demand more Indianization of civil services, they will also understand that there is a limit on which government opportunities or employments can be created. If we were to increase employment in India, then we must have political power in our own hands. So a deeper analysis and understanding of these grievances will lead to a much better response qualitatively by Indians. So the focus will shift from grievances to the root cause, which was British colonial structure. The response will be now more forward-looking and progressive in terms of ideas and values. Instead of the earlier response, which wanted to go back, shift the clocks of the hands of the clock backwards, here the idea will be to go ahead in time, adapt with new modern values and ideas. Ideas like secularism, ideas like rationalism, ideas like individual liberty and freedom, all of those will be very central to the modern response. Indians will now demand a very different type of society, polity, and economy in this traditional response. Modern response. This will be more broad-based and also consistent and long-term. Modern response will not be local, episodic, brief. It will be something that will be going on or continuing over a long period of time. Why? Because it has this robust base. It has a much better understanding. It has a much more sound goal and methodology for achieving it. And therefore, it was possible for the modern response under the leadership of our founding fathers to actually go on for a longer period of time. So sustained and long term will be the characteristics of modern response. Okay. Mostly these type of responses will be non-violent in nature. Since these are modern responses, they will refrain from use of violence. Unlike the traditional responses, which tried to use force and violence to revert back to old times, the modern response will use modern political methods of mobilization, opinion building, putting pressure on the government, so on and so forth. So these will be the two types of responses. Now, what we are going to do now is enter into the traditional response and see their types one after another today. Before I do that, let me just give you a quick overview of what will be the different ways of traditional and modern responses. We have understood their characteristics. Now let us see their ways. Traditional and modern response. Traditional response will include civil rebellions, peasant unrest, and tribal uprisings that will take place in the 18th and 19th centuries. Civil rebellions, tribal uprisings, and peasant unrests. These are all having the same characteristics of traditional response. Revolt of 1857 is actually the biggest case study of this type of response, that is traditional response. We can also call it a reaction because here the nature is spontaneous and it is based on immediate grievances. It's local. It's not a long-term response based on bigger understanding. So these were the types of traditional responses or reactions. On the other hand, in modern response, the first major development will be development of economic critique of the British rule in India. Economists like Dadabhai Naoroji, G.V. Joshi, Subramanya Iyer, and many others will analyze the British economic policies and put forth how they were impoverishing India. This will develop a much more robust clarity about British colonial rule, and that will give a fillip to modern response. How will that happen? We will start to see the crystallization of modern nationalism in India. The press will become more and more vocal about exploitation by British and rights of Indians. We will see that several political organizations will be born around mid-19th century. And all of this will finally culminate in the creation of Indian National Congress. And Indian National Congress will then lead the freedom struggle of the country. So these will be the actual ways through which Indians will respond to British rule, traditional and modern. Now what we are going to do is we are going to dive deeper in this and the following lecture into the traditional response and see their various case studies. All right. Let us now see the three types of traditional responses first. The first in that is civil rebellions. Civil rebellions were led by non-military populations like deposed Rajas, Nawabs, Zamindars, etc., in which masses joined them. Peasants, artisans, demobilized soldiers, all of these people joined and they fought back against the British rule. These type of rebellions are called as civil rebellions. This is the first type of traditional response. For example, we will see this in case of Diwan Veluthampi or Raja of Vizianagaram or Nawab of Awadh. Many of these cases will see traditional feudal elites leading a fight using all the sections of the society against British rule, that is civil rebellions. The second type is tribal uprisings. We'll see that tribal people will get organized and they will lead their struggle against the new British rule because of their grievances. What were their grievances? Lack of access to land and forest due to British policies. Britishers will bring about new laws and rules that will completely tear apart the traditional way of life of tribals. And consequently, we will see big tribal uprisings such as the Santhal Hool, the Munda uprising, the Chuar uprising, the Bhil uprising, so on and so forth. In many different areas, these tribal communities who had a particular way of life, but their way of life was, interfered with by the British rule, they will feel frustrated and they will rise up against the British rule to go back to their earlier systems. That is called as tribal uprisings. The third type will be peasant movements. Now, since land revenue was a very important source for British government here in India, consequently, the Britishers designed many different types of land revenue policies over the decades. But the outcome of all of these policies was the same from the perspective of Indian peasants. It led to his impoverishment and exploitation. Now, naturally, suffering because of these British policies, many peasants will rise up against the British rule in the 18th and 19th century. They will want to again revert back to earlier systems where they had much more certainty and much more rights in the functioning of the economy. So consequently, we'll see many peasant movements during this period. These are the three types of traditional responses. Now let us dive deeper into the civil rebellions and see some of the major case studies regarding them. All right. So we are now going to go into important civil rebellions and uprisings. Before I do that, a very important announcement and a good news for all of you guys over here. We are observing the super learning days today, tomorrow, and the day after, where the batches of StudyIQ IAS, the September batch, is now available for you at a very heavily discounted price, 27,000 only. Using my code, you can seek admission to this batch, P2I batch for 2024 as well as 2025 long-term batch at a discounted price. But this offer is only for 3 days, at the end of which, that is 30th September, we are going to close our admissions completely. After that, you don't have any option to take admission in these batches. So guys, hurry up, make the most of this opportunity, use this code and avail the discount to enroll for the best one-stop solution for civil services exam preparation needs, which is your P2I batch. All right, it's available in Hindi, English, as well as in English mediums. So you can choose the medium that suits you the best. Guys, these batches have online live lectures where you interact with the faculty. You have mentors who guide you and handhold you through the entire process. You have books and study material of world-class quality. You have test series, daily tests, weekly tests, and a lot more. All that is required for you to have a proper ecosystem for preparing for this examination has been made available in this foolproof process. The P2I batch, guys, is the solution for all your civil services preparation needs. So make the most of this opportunity. All right. Now let us start with some of the case studies. Now, in case of mains, if the question is asked, as it has been asked earlier also, the nature of the question was something like this, that Revolt of 1857 was actually the culmination of many previous such episodes. I'm not quoting verbatim, but I'm telling you the essence of it. Revolt of 1857, as I told you guys, was the biggest case study of traditional type of response. Before Revolt of 1857, there were many other smaller, localized kind of events that took place, revolts and uprisings that took place. Revolt of 1857 amplifies that on a much bigger scale. So the statement that was given over there was obviously a correct one, and we had to justify that with proper evidence. How would we do that? We can do that by the explanation of traditional response and its nature and substantiating it with the case studies that we are going to see now. So let us see some of the more important case studies of traditional response, starting with the Sanyasi, aka or Fakir revolt or rebellion. What is this Sanyasi revolt or rebellion? First, try to locate the exact context, guys. In 1757, Battle of Plassey was fought, and East India Company was able to win that and establish its monopoly over trade of Bengal, make the Nawab of Bengal a virtual puppet. Then comes the Battle of Buxar. Once again, East India Company was able to defeat a big Indian coalition and subsequently got Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa under Treaty of Allahabad. These wars and the Treaty of Allahabad completely altered the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Now, East India Company was in the driving seat, trying to design policies that would be best suited for their commercial and economic interest. East India Company at this point is not even sure how long they will be able to rule over this area. Consequently, in early years of East India Company's rule, we will see that many different types of experiments will be made. May it be the dual government of Lord Clive or the revenue farming that was done by Warren Hastings. East India Company is groping in the dark, trying to find policies which will serve their interest best. But in this process, because of these experiments and because of this transition, there will be a lot of dislocation for the Indians. And because of this dislocation, we will see different sections of the society will rebel, starting with the sannyasis, the mendicants. The policies that were implemented by Lord Clive in Bengal led to the infamous famine of 1770. The infamous famine of 1770 had washed away almost 1/3 population of Bengal. That was how destructive it was in terms of its intensity. The harsh economic policies that the British had imposed had led to many of these sannyasis and dispossessed peasants to take up arms against the British East India Company. The sannyasis had been used to a certain way of life. They were wandering mendicants who were seen as a threat by East India Company. EIC has just established its rules, so it is very finicky about anybody who can play a role of a rebel. These sannyasis who traditionally wielded weapons, who were not settled in one place, who were swelling in numbers also because a lot of peasants are losing their lands and consequently they are joining such groups. So this became a big threat for East India Company. And consequently, we'll see that East India Company will try to regulate these sannyasis very harshly, leading to fights and rebellions. Broadly, from 1763 to 1800, over a large period of 3.5 decades and more, we will see that these mendicants will be in conflict with East India Company. Now, we have to understand that sannyasis do not have a state backing as such. Okay, so whatever they are doing is out of their own initiative, and consequently, we will not hear of single major battle-like events. This will be like a low intensity but constant kind of tension between these communities and the East India Company's state. And using the local territory to their advantage, they will be able to continue the struggle for a very long period of time. The areas over which this struggle will be waged will largely be in eastern India, in districts of Purnia, Malda, Dhaka, Dinajpur, Rangpur, Cooch Behar, and also Murshidabad. So some of the northern districts of Bengal and eastern areas of the then Bengal, we will see the activities of these sannyasis and also Muslim fakirs. So sannyasis and fakirs both will rebel. Whenever we study these revolts individually, we just need to know a little bit of basics. Background of the revolt, in what context it is happening, the tentative period and region of it, who were the major leaders as such, and how did it contribute. So these 4 areas we need to remember. From prelims perspective, there can always be questions, and there have been a lot of questions asked from here. From mains perspective, we will be using these as examples to substantiate a larger point. So in that context, please remember guys that we don't have to do a PhD on each of these topics as such. A sufficient understanding is good enough for us. Causes of this revolt: famine of that period, harsh economic policies of the Britishers, restrictions on pilgrims. East India Company wanted to stabilize the population of these mendicants in one area, not allow them to move about freely. And that led to restrictions in the form of regulation of 1788. This will create challenges or problems for the mendicants. Rent-free lands being restricted now. Earlier, during the times of the Nawabs, these mendicants had access to rent-free lands from the state. But now East India Company was not in any mood of extending such privileges. Therefore, these mendicants will suffer from economic hardship also. Important leaders in this: Majnu Shah, Chirag Ali, Devi Chaudhrani, and Bhavani Pathak. Some of the names which potentially can be asked in prelims. Result of this: Warren Hastings suppressed the revolt by using brute military force. He brought in the army of East India Company wherever the numbers of the sannyasis and fakirs was strong enough, and using military force, these rebellions were suppressed in many different areas. But since it was like a hydra-headed kind of a revolt, that is why, without any fixed leadership and region as such, that is why it will keep on erupting every now and then in many different places, and consequently we have a larger time horizon for this. I hope you got this, guys. Okay. The sannyasis and fakirs were traditionally seen as rogue elements by the British. Warren Hastings himself wrote that they are like the gypsies of Hindustan. The gypsies are a community in Europe who are people who are nomadic people who don't settle in one place. And traditionally in Europe, these people have been looked at with suspicion. So Britishers brought those biases here to India, biases based on European society. And they felt that these fakirs and sannyasis, they are also a threat. They saw them as plunderers and freebooters who were looting other people who are settled. Throughout the 19th century, right up to independence, in fact, we'll see that the Britishers will always look at such communities with great suspicion. They would rather want such communities to settle down in one place. Government wanted to control their pilgrimages so that these people don't go about spreading the doctrine of violence against the state, and secondly, control their practice of carrying arms. Now, like as it was the practice traditionally for mendicants in India, they used to wield arms, and these arms were seen by the Britishers as great threat. Now, these were generally traditional arms, your pikes and swords kind of stuff, but they also had matchlock guns. Sometimes they had matchlock guns also. So British felt that such a big armed population, which is not stable in one place, is a danger to the state. Okay. Hindus and Muslims both participated here in large numbers. A historian has given an opinion in this manner, a recent research. Sanyasi rebellion was a collective political expression of protest, collective political expression, which means what? Many different sections of the society are involved in this. Against the company state's despotism by impoverished peasants. So it's not as if it is only sannyasis. The sannyasis are leaders, but then the actual participants are peasants, unemployed artisans, disbanded soldiers. Because a lot of armies had got disbanded. Now the Nawabs and Maharajas, they did not need these many troops. So these guys are unemployed, who were led by popular religious figures. So these sannyasis and fakirs, they gave the leadership. They kind of had the moral authority, right? Their moral authority gives legitimacy to the action of these disgruntled elements of the society. So in this manner, the Sanyasi revolt became a very important event in the history of India back then. Using the geography of that area, this is part of Bengal, mostly in eastern part of Bengal, which is very riverine, marshy, a lot of, monsoon. East India Company was still new in terms of a political power, and therefore they used that terrain to their great advantage, and they were able to perpetuate the struggle for a fairly long period of time. But then, of course, the outcome as such will not be very significant and concrete. Anand Math, the novel by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay or Chatterjee, is basically based on this same Sanyasi revolt, a fact that we must remember for prelims. And Bande Mataram or Vande Mataram, the national song, has been adopted from this same novel of Anand Math. Apart from this, there is another novel by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Devi Chaudrani, which is based on the leader, one of the leader of this revolt, a woman leader, Devi Chaudrani. This particular novel was banned by the British government, and it was only very late, I think after independence directly, this particular novel was then once again republished. Naturally, the intent of the novel was to preach that gospel of resistance. So because of that, British government had banned this particular novel. So that was about the Sanyasi revolt, guys. Now let us see revolt in Midnapur and Dhalbhum. Midnapur and Dhalbhum. Where is this area? You can see on the map over here. This is West Midnapur and next to it is East Midnapur. In this particular area, we are going to see revolt in Midnapur and Dhalbhum. Background is the rise of East India Company, especially its revenue related policies. Britishers were slowly changing their policies and will bring about a big push with the new revenue system in 1772 when Warren Hastings takes over. This will lead to conflicts between the traditional zamindars and the British East India Company in the areas of Midnapur and Dhalbhum. Remember guys, we have seen how Murshid Quli Khan had, during his rule, established very big and powerful zamindars. Now the zamindars of this area of Midnapur, they were powerful, they had their own troops, and more importantly, they had very good relations with their ryots also. But with this new revenue system coming in, not just this one, right from the time when Britishers take over in the form of dual government, from that time onwards, we will see a lot of tweaking going on. This will lead to a lot of inconvenience for the Indian zamindars and their ryots. Consequently, in Midnapur and Dhalbhum, we'll see that these zamindars, along with their ryots, will rise up against the British East India Company. Here we have to remember two important names, Damodar Singh and Jagannath Dhal. Damodar Singh and Jagannath Dhal, these were the two important leaders. Zamindars, Talukdars and ryots together, they fought in this particular revolt against the East India Company. EIC used its military power to fight against the zamindars, and ultimately it was able to suppress it, and new revenue system was introduced in this area with force. Please remember 1772, around this time, East India Company is in a big financial crisis. They want to recover the maximum amount of money in minimum time, because they are owing a lot of money to the British government, to the Bank of England, and to many other lenders. Therefore, they will use force, brutal force, to suppress any revolt and gain as much as possible in shortest time. So that was in Midnapur area. Now let us see the next one. Civil uprising in Gorakhpur, Basti and Bahraich areas. So these are all areas in Uttar Pradesh, modern day Uttar Pradesh, okay, eastern UP to be more precise. This is Gorakhpur over here. This is Basti and Bahraich. So in these districts, we will see an uprising during the times of Warren Hastings. Now, what was the cause or background of this uprising? Warren Hastings, who has been given the clear-cut responsibility of recovering EIC's financial position. What will he do? He will send English officers as revenue farmers, to these areas. We have seen the concept of revenue farming, guys, where the right of collection of revenue is actually given to the highest bidder, that is revenue farming. So on similar lines, English officers will be sent as revenue farmers, whose task will be to maximize the collection of revenue from these areas. Naturally, these revenue farmers are not concerned with the long-term health of that area. Whether the farmers will do well with this demand or no, they are not concerned. They want to make the maximum money in the given amount of time. And therefore, this will lead to excessive demand of revenue on the farmers, leading to rebellion by zamindars and peasants in our area. Okay, rebellion by these zamindars and their peasants. Around 1781. Regions Gorakhpur, Basti and Bahraich, these districts will be the hotbed of it. Warren Hastings' revenue experiment will be the reason behind it, and Alexander Hannay, we need to remember the name, will be the Izara Dar, the revenue farmer who will be sent here. Alexander Hannay, who was well versed with this region, was given this responsibility. The outcome will be a rebellion which will be suppressed by British brute force, but then Hannay will be dismissed, and they will try to pacify this particular region. So this is the civil uprising in Gorakhpur, Basti and Bahraich area. I hope you got the context, guys. We are seeing the traditional response, and you can see the characteristics are very visible. What do the people who are participating in it demand? They're not demanding end of British colonial rule as such. They're only focused on the immediate challenges that they are facing. What are the immediate challenges? They're facing the problem of excessive demand. So under the leadership of their feudal elites, zamindars, people are going to fight against British rule. Violent, brief, intense. suppressed easily by the Britishers. They're not connected with other things. They're not like connected, say, for example, with the Sanyasi revolt. They are very localized in terms of their grievances and demands. This is civil uprising in Gorakhpur, Basti and Bahraich. After this, we must know about the revolt of Raja of Vizianagaram. On the map, you can see the region, although it only marks out one district, Vishakhapatnam. The area of the ruler was much larger than this, but this gives you some sense about it, which region we are talking about. So this is the area of coastal Andhra Pradesh. The Britishers were very keen about getting hold of this area. Why so? The reason was, down south, Madras was their most important possession in South India. And in the east, they had Bengal. But in between, they lacked that geographical connectivity. I mean, of course, they could use the sea route, but then they also wanted to have physical contiguity as well, land contiguity. And for that region, this area, which is called as Northern Sarkars, which is coastal part of Andhra and Odisha, was of great interest to the Britishers. Now, in this context, we have to understand the revolt of Raja of Vizianagaram. What happened over here? The background of this is that the British had signed an agreement or treaty with Ananda Gajapati Raju, ruler of this area, to fight together and expel the French from those areas. Together they fought and expelled the French from that area. Subsequently, the ruler Ananda Gajapati Raju, he passed away. But after he passes away, the English, as was typical of them, refused to honor the treaty that was signed with the ruler. They instead demanded tribute from the next successor, who is Vijay Ramaraju. They demand tribute from him. About 3 lakh rupees they demand from him. Further, they also say that he will have to disband his troops if he is not able to pay this. So this was completely unfair on part of the British to make such an unrealistic demand. Now, naturally, no self-respecting ruler would accept such a condition without, putting his best in and fighting against the British East India Company. So the ruler of Vizianagaram will fight against it in 1794. In this fight, the English will be able to defeat the ruler and pension him off. They will pension him off. But he refuses to give up still and continues to fight. And in the famous battle of Padmanabham, he will be finally defeated for good. After this, the East India Company will put his son on the throne and become a little more conciliatory with reduced demand in terms of tribute. So once again over here, guys, we are seeing that Indians are fighting under the leadership of traditional chiefs and elites against the British, who have been able to establish their power. So demands are local, grievances are local, spread is also local. There is no larger understanding as such. We are in no way trying to undermine the significance of it, but we are just trying to see how this will later evolve, into a modern response. So this is revolt of Raja of Vizianagaram. Please remember that this area is a probable area for prelims. We must know about the region, about the personality who is involved in the process, and a little bit of background and consequences, what happened because of it. That is sufficient for us. Then comes civil rebellion in Awadh. Now the area of Awadh we have seen earlier also in maps, but just for the sake of clarity, this is the north central area of Uttar Pradesh. This area is called as Awadh, with Lucknow as the capital of that state. Now what had happened in Awadh? Awadh's context was the replacement of Wazir Ali Khan as Nawab of Awadh. Nawab of Awadh, Wazir Ali Khan, was replaced by his own uncle Sadat Ali Khan II. Now Wazir Ali Khan had been brought to the throne with British help. And as was expected, the British had done a quid pro quo. There were no free lunches. during British times. I mean, there are never free lunches, but the Britishers always wanted something in return. So when he becomes the Nawab, the British want him to reward the company back. But when he seemed to be incapable of doing it, they very summarily replace him by his uncle Sadat Ali Khan, and this will lead to the civil rebellion, Nawab of Awadh. So the British were making consistent demands on the Nawab. When he could not meet it, they replaced him by his uncle and pensioned him off to Benares. So Sadat Ali Khan is made the Nawab and Wazir Ali Khan is sent to Benares as a pensioner of East India Company. Now there in Benares, this man who is now seething in anger, he was invited by British resident George Frederick Cherry for a lunch or dinner, whatever the case must have been. And at that time, he assassinated him along with some other Europeans and even attacked the magistrate of Benares. This came to be known as the Massacre of Benares. In this context, the army of Wazir Ali Khan, a few thousand troops, had to confront with the army of East India Company, and East India Company was able to defeat his army, and he fled from that scene and took asylum at the court of Udaipur. The ruler of Udaipur gives him asylum, and later East India Company will cajole force Udaipur to hand him over to East India Company in return of a promise that he will not be harmed. So he is taken over and then sent to Calcutta, where he will be kept in confinement. This is civil rebellion in Awadh. Now in this rebellion also, soldiers, common people who were affected by British rule, all of those join in this rebellion and try to fight against the British army. But then they will be defeated. This is civil rebellion in Awadh. After this comes uprising in Palamu. Uprising in Palamu, modern day Jharkhand. It will be led by one Bhukan Singh, who is the chief of the Chero tribe. Concern will be local agrarian revenue related issues, the changed systems that British will bring about, that will lead to a lot of economic dislocation in this area, and consequently in 1800, 1802 in Palamu and Sarguja, we will see that the people of this tribe, they will rise and fight against the British. Result, again the same, suppressed. This will be a common thing, guys, with all of these rebellions. Individually, they will fight over local grievances, local spread, and East India Company will suppress them one by one. So this rebellion was also suppressed, and Colonel Jones played an important role in this particular fight. He was posted over here for some time and he suppressed all of these disturbances. So we just need to remember uprising in Palamu, Chero chief Bhukan Singh, the area where the rebellion took place, and what was the outcome. Outcome always largely remains the same. After this, the next one is the Poligars Revolt. The Poligars Revolt in South India. Poligars were local warlords from the times of Vizianagaram Empire. These local warlords were like, small vassals. They are powerful local chiefs who used to serve the overlord, that is emperor of the Vijayanagar state. Now, we will see that these Poligars, who traditionally had a lot of autonomy, will rise up against East India Company in this decade from 1795 to 1805. Now, in multiple bursts, in three different, crisis situations, these chiefs will fight against East India Company. 1795 to 99, 1800 to 102, and 1802 to 1805. These will be the three major crises in which Poligars will fight. Okay, so this is the time context that we must know. The area that will be affected will be Tineveli or Tirunelveli, as we know, Ramanathapuram, Shivaganga, Shivagiri, Madurai, North Arcot, Chittur, Chandragiri, and Charagallu. These areas will see the rising of Poligars. Why did the Poligars rise? Two major reasons in different phases we must know. Reason number one was the Nawab of Carnatic or Nawab of Arcot, as also we can say, was a puppet of the East India Company, and under East India Company's pressure, he handed over the management of Tirunelveli and adjoining areas to East India Company. Now, East India Company naturally was not ready to accept the traditional, local chief type of role that Polygars were playing for centuries in this area. And this brought into conflict EIC and the Polygars. Apart from this, there was also the issue of right of collecting the Kawal fees. Now, what was the Kawal fee? Kawal fee or watch fee was an ancient institution of Tamil Nadu wherein village police officers had this special right and responsibility that they used to guard over the law and order situation in the village, and in return they could collect a small fee. This was a special privilege that had gone on for centuries, from ancient times in fact. And when this was stopped by East India Company, East India Company says that we are now modernizing police force in India. That is why we don't need traditional institutions. Remember, Cornwallis had divested the zamindars in Bengal of their responsibility. The same idea is going to be extended in South India also. When that is done, the Kawal fee was abolished, and consequently, this was the second reason for the revolt. These rebels were eventually suppressed by East India Company, although they fought very vigorously. The details of the wars and all that are not required because it is very unlikely that inside of that the details of wars will be asked by UPSC. But eventually they are suppressed. Most of the chiefs, they will be killed in those wars, and some will be allowed to reside in Madras with some specific concessions. Nawab of Arcot, after this war is over, Nawab of Arcot, who was in any case a British puppet, we have discussed at great length the Carnatic Wars and seen how Nawab of Arcot was basically the establishment of East India Company only. Muhammad Ali was made the Nawab of Arcot because of Lord Clive's boldness, and therefore perpetually grateful that the Nawab of Arcot was a virtual puppet. He was made to surrender his powers to the East India Company. And with this, South India will now pass into complete control of EIC. All right. Yes. After this, next important revolt is that of Diwan Velu Thampi or Dalava. Diwan means prime minister basically. I mean, it's an analogy just to relate. It's not the modern democratic style prime minister, but then a person who discharged a similar important role for that princely state, also called as Dalava. Diwan Velu Thempi's revolt is what we must know. This is an important revolt. The state of Travancore, of which he was the Diwan, state of Travancore was located in southern part of Kerala. Unlike northern states which had been gobbled up by the Mysorean state, Travancore had been able to preserve itself against the expansionism of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan. Travancore was a powerful state in that sense. It had built a modern Western style army, and consequently it was able to survive. But perpetually threatened, Travancore had become an ally of East India Company. East India Company also required a friend on the west coast in Kerala, just south of the Mysorean state. So geostrategically, it was a very big advantage for East India Company to have it as its friend. After Tipu Sultan was, dealt with, defeated completely and killed, East India Company will show its true colors to Travancore also. They will force Travancore to sign a subsidiary alliance treaty. Harsh conditions were imposed on Travancore by the subsidiary alliance, and a resident was posted in their capital. Now, this resident, as was typical, used to do a lot of interference in the internal functioning of this state. Now, the Diwan of state of Travancore, he will become very frustrated at this constant interference of East India Company, and around this time of 1808-09, he will revolt with his own army. Travancore and the area specifically of Kundara is where this revolt will be concentrated. He gathered around him Nair warriors. Nairs are the fighting community of Kerala who wholeheartedly join in this struggle for a national dignity as such, and then they fight against East India Company, but then ultimately they are overwhelmed, and in this the Maharaja of Travancore, instead of actually supporting his divan, he defected to the other side, that is British side. So the Maharaja's troops were ranged with the Britishers against the divan of that state. Ultimately, seeing that defeat is imminent, he committed suicide and the rebellion was suppressed. This was the revolt of Diwan Velu Thampi. After this, briefly, we must know about disturbances in the Bundelkhand region. Where is Bundelkhand area? It is part of southern UP and some part of Madhya Pradesh also. Bundelkhand has many districts in UP as well as some in Madhya Pradesh as well. Bundela chiefs in this area, the Bundela chiefs, there are many hill forts in this area. The Bundela chiefs had been under the overlordship of Marathas. Jhansi is also a part of that, and that is why Jhansi, Rani of Jhansi, who was basically of Marathi origin, she was the ruler in that area. So Bundela chiefs had been under the different Maratha chiefs, and after the Marathas were defeated in the Second Anglo-Maratha War, East India Company will try to impose its rule on these chiefs. And consequently, we'll see that these chiefs who had several forts in the area, they will constantly rebel against the Britishers after the Second Anglo-Maratha War from 1808 to 1812. Lakshman Dawa of Ajaygarh and Darya Singh of Kalinjar, the famous fort of Kalinjar from medieval times, a very formidable fort that every Sultan of Delhi, whenever a new Sultan established his rule during the Sultanate period, very often he had to come down and win this particular fort, a very historic fort in that sense. These will be the leaders whose names we must know. These chiefs, they kept on constantly, challenging the authority of the British. Given the topography of that region, inaccessibility because of the topography and all the other challenges associated with it, the Britishers, although they suppressed it, but after that, they will try to have some kind of conciliation and will impose a policy binding down the chieftains with contractual obligations. Ikrar namas, okay, or written as ikrar namas. Basically, it's a Persian word. Ikrar means that you consent to, you agree to something. That is ikrar nama. So contractual obligations will be imposed on whom? On these Bundela chiefs. They will agree to it, and that is how this area will be brought to peace after several years of fighting. So this is disturbance in Bundela. Then comes Kutch rebellion. The area of Kutch in Gujarat, which borders with the Sindh area of Pakistan today, the area of Kutch, there will be a power struggle between the British and Maharaja Bharmal II. The context of this struggle from 1816 to 32, so it's a fairly long struggle between the two sides, was the excessive demand of revenue that the British state was imposing on the state of Kutch through the Maratha chief Gaikwad. Okay, through Maratha chief, this particular demand was being imposed on Kutch. Okay, Kutch ruler Rao Bharmal II was defeated and deposed by East India Company in this war. They were forced out, and in his place his infant son was declared as the ruler under a regency, and that regency was in control of the Britishers. But when the East India Company will suffer some reverses in the Burmese war, once again Bharmal II and some chiefs around him, they will once again revolt against the Britishers, demanding reinstating of the original ruler Bharmal II. British East India Company realized the futility of this struggle and tried to follow a conciliatory policy with this ruler. So in this manner, they will come to terms with the rule of Bharmal II and settle that issue in a conciliatory way. So this is the uprising in Kutch state as such. Okay. Lastly, we'll see the Paika rebellion of Odisha. The Paikas. The Paikas, it is derived from the term Paiks, who were basically what? Traditional landed militia who fought for the Raja of Kharda. Okay, they were militia, as in they are not standing army as such. They are given land assignments in return for which these Paiks, as they are called individually, these Paiks are supposed to deliver military service for the ruler. East India Company, after defeating Marathas, had taken over this area. You remember Odisha had been ceded to Marathas by Nawab Ali Vardi Khan, and till the Marathas are defeated, this area was under Maratha chiefs. After the Marathas are defeated, this area is taken over by East India Company. Now, East India Company's policies will be implemented. Now, these policies will naturally hurt the traditional interests of these Paiks. Conquest of Odisha led to removal of Raja of Kharda, who was actually the benefactor of these Paiks. The power of these Paiks, who were traditional landed kind of elites in that society, was naturally reduced. The state was imposing high revenue demand on the people living over here. So they are doing two things. They are fighters, infantrymen in the army, and also they have land, so they are agriculturists also. So on both ends, they have suffered. They have lost that traditional employment now that Raja of Kharda has been removed, and at the same time, they are suffering because of high revenue demand of the Britishers as well. Because of this, Paiks will be in a very desperate economic situation. To add fuel to fire, the local currency, which was based on cowries, shells, that local currency was abolished, and instead the revenue had to be paid in terms of silver. So this further made the economic situation very unbearable for these men. Remember their background, they are warriors, they are battle hardened. Furthermore, they are being subjected to this humiliation and economic burden. Naturally, there would be a revolt from this section. We'll see Jagbandhu Vidyadhar, name of the leader is important. Jagbandhu Vidyadhar, who was the military chief of Raja of Kharda, he will rise up and fight against the East India Company. This rebellion will be brutally repressed and suppressed by EIC by 1818. They fought very bravely. A lot of men lost their lives in this war, but ultimately their rebellion was suppressed. It is said Jagbandhu Vidyadhar, he continued to evade the arrest by Britishers, but ultimately a negotiated settlement was arranged. However, this rebellion was able to extract several concessions from East India Company. For example, a remission was given in terms of arrears. Arrears as in whatever was remaining to be paid, that was remitted by the British government. Assessments were reduced. Assessment is the amount that the state believes the farmer must pay as revenue. So that assessment was reduced and a new settlement on fixed tenures was implemented. So major demands were addressed in this manner. The state also had to come to terms because of the long valiant fight that the Paikas had given. So these were some of the more important civil rebellions, guys. What do we need to remember about these civil rebellions? We don't have to go into the details of how the wars were fought, so on and so forth, as some textbooks will detail. Here, when the question comes from mains perspective, it will be based more on characteristics, and these case studies you can then use as examples. So we need to know brief information about these. When was it fought? The region, leadership, causes, consequences. If broadly 4 or 5 points then the task is done. In prelims, some fact-based questions are asked on this area, but then there also, if you know these basic things, that is more than sufficient for us. In our next class, guys, we will continue our discussion on the traditional response and see the tribal uprisings and the various peasant unrests that we see because of establishment of British rule. Thank you very much. I'll see you in my next class. If you found this lecture helpful, then do like this video, share it with your friends, and leave some love in the comment box. Take care.